Hare Krishna. We have some questions about women's rights. What about women's rights? It seems like the movement is more focused on men's rights than women's rights. Is that true? And if so, what do we do about it? Or is it wrong that that's not true? Or is it not even an issue? Let's talk about it. First thought I have on this issue is about representation. When we're organizing a movement, we need representation from youth, from women, from older devotees, from senior devotees, because we each represent a different context, different interest. For example, in the early days of the movement, we never saw any resolutions regarding taking care of senior devotees, obviously because we didn't have any, or we had very few. But it doesn't mean there wouldn't be senior devotees in 30 years. Obviously there would be. So you would think we would be thinking about preparing for that time. But we weren't. And one of the reasons we weren't, I believe, is because there were no senior people on the GBC. Of course, we didn't have senior people, so that's why there weren't any on the GBC. But my point is, don't you think if there were senior people on the GBC or senior people working with the GBC who could be represented by the GBC, there would have been some legislation or some discussion about how to take care of the elderly? How will the retired devotees live? What about hospice care, etc., etc.? As the devotees got older, there was more consideration about health. There was a Ministry of Health, more consideration about dying and so forth because it was happening. But my point is, it was because we had senior devotees, they were thinking about these things. Young people don't think about dying. It's just out of their context. In the same way, issues regarding children, issues regarding women, who is going to best represent those? It will be women. So in situations where there's little or no representation of women within the management of a temple or a project, unless the men are very focused on representing the needs of their various constituencies, then you're going to find less of an emphasis of a representative. How should I say that? You're going to find less of a representation of the needs of those constituencies. So if you ever find a situation where you're in a temple or a project and you feel that the rights or the needs of particular groups are not being represented well, it's probably because the management doesn't consist of those groups, or they're not thinking that those groups, maybe they do represent those groups, but maybe they don't understand actually how to represent or what they need. So when the question of women's rights comes in, women should have all opportunity to do service. Of course, they shouldn't be restricted. And in certain cases, socially, there may be some restriction to prevent mingling of sexes, but basically, if they're qualified to do services, there should be some facility to do that, maybe within the context of women only. That's another issue for another talk. But equal rights on the spiritual level is that you're not going to be discriminated against because you're a woman. Does that happen? Does it seem like it happens? And the answer is yes, sometimes it does happen. Sometimes it does seem like it happens. Is that right? The answer is no, it's not right. What's the reason? Again, it may be due to not enough representation of the women. It could be due to a misunderstanding. It could be a cultural thing in certain parts of the world. It may not be acceptable for women to have any kind of prominent role. Every situation is different. I'm speaking of a general principle. And the general principle is if you find a situation in your temple or project where certain groups are not, you feel their rights are not being heard, it's probably because in the organization, they are not represented on the temple board or temple council. So there has to be more discussion about their needs, or if you feel there's been any abuses or any minimizations, then it needs to be brought out and discussed in the context of fulfilling their needs, but also in the context of Srila Prabhupada's instructions and Srila Prabhupada's example. And Prabhupada's example is that he encouraged everyone to serve to their capacity. And again, as I said, consideration of social context. Hare Krishna, I hope that answers your question. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.